Oh, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope that you're all keeping as well as well can be. My name is Marcus Barnett. I sit on Young Labour's National Committee, and I'm also the Associate Editor of Tribune, Jacobin's affiliate publication in the UK. And tonight we are going to be talking about the future of the left. So with me, I have John-Baptiste Oduor, who's a teacher and a PhD student who's active in the Labour Party in London. I have my colleague at Tribune, Grace Blakeley, who is a staff writer at Tribune and has just published a book. I have just forgotten the name. Stolen, of course.
Yeah.
It's called Stolen, and it is there we are. Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. It's an absolute banger. And David Broder, who is the European editor at Jacobin. I recognise it's very late, and particularly late, I think, for David. So I'll try not to be too long. But obviously, you know, the Corbyn and the Sanders moments have gone now. That seemed like it was our one shot at socialism, and in a British context, people seemed quite up for barbarism, and we got the vote in December, which we got, and that not only was that defeat just in and of itself, it was compounded by the defeat of the Labour left in the form of Rebecca Long-Bailey's crushing loss of the Labour leadership elections down to Keir Starmer. And we sit at a very strange precipice now. Even internally within the left, there's a very, very increasingly intense debate about the future of Momentum and where people want to go, the sort of personnel that, you know, people want to lead it. And by the end of, by this time next month, we will have a new election to Momentum's NCG, which will have determined the new left leadership. And, you know, I think it's time now, you know, as good as any time really, to have a proper discussion, a proper debate about what really went on under Corbyn, what went on under Sanders, and, you know, try and tie these things together here, but also to, you know, to focus really on what went wrong, and particularly at a time now where we're all looking to, you know, increasingly extra parliamentary forms of action. You know, what can we learn from this era? What really went wrong? What is the role of the left in a social democratic party in Europe now? So I'll go first to John-Baptiste, who just wrote an interesting essay for Verso on socialism and party democracy. There it is. Go straight ahead whenever you like, John-Baptiste.
Thanks for the introduction, Marcus. So one of the kind of problems or confusions I was trying to respond to in the essay is the kind of the strange and myriad ways that people are using the concept of democracy and attempting to use the idea of democracy to defend the Corbyn project. So I think one of the beliefs that are kind of widely held by Corbyn supporters and supporters of his campaign, including myself, was that it was democracy that brought Corbyn to power, and it would be democracy that would lead to the resurgence of the left. So I want to try and say a little bit about organizational democracy and a little bit about electoral democracy and how those two pose specific problems for the British left. So I think that there were kind of good and noble reasons behind the faith in party and electoral democracy. And I think this faith wasn't adequately coupled with a realistic idea of the problems the left faced. So as I see it, there were two strategic challenges for any kind of social democratic or socialist left that needed to be confronted. The first was the kind of difficulty of reconciling the conflicting interests between supporters of the socialist movement, in our case Labour, and the second was the kind of actual weakness of the left. So what I want to try and suggest is that it was the second problem that led to the first. That is, it was the weakness of the left that made it difficult to reconcile the conflicting interests between supporters of the Labour Party. And this came to the head in the call for sections of the activist left for Labour's referendum. I don't really want to get into that, but yeah, we'll come back to that in the end. So the inability to kind of reconcile the conflicting interests was, I think, a result of a kind of structural problem, which socialist and social democratic parties working within a democracy have to face. This problem is that the notion of the working class, that is the group that socialists are supposed to work to organize, is an ambiguous one. So when we talk about the working class, we can mean, if we're using a really general, broad notion, everyone that has to work for a living. Or we can also mean a specific group of people, say, for example, everyone that works in productive industries, transport and logistics, etc. Now, like, the difficulty with the first category is that it's so broad that it lacks any sense of homogeneity. Now, the second has value insofar as it helps us to create a sense of class identity. So people can identify with their role as, for instance, a nurse or a teacher or a miner or whatever profession you want to pick. But the problem with it is that the working class, understood in a restrictive sense, has never constituted a majority in any advanced capitalist democracy. If the working class, if you understand them as in the very restrictive sense that I gave earlier, as people working in productive industries, transport, logistics. So with the exception of maybe Belgium in the beginning of the 20th century, that kind of working class has never constituted a majority. So since the second definition of the working class is too restrictive, socialists have to jump back and forth between the first and the second. So you have to, and the reason they have to do this is so they can win majorities in an electoral system where the working class are a minority. But this game of jumping back and forth isn't one without kind of political losses. In jumping from the working class in the restrictive sense, say workers, now in our context, let's say workers without a university degree working in the service sector, to the working class in the broader sense, we have to organize the hierarchy within the political coalition that we're forming in this process. Now, one of the ways of understanding this is that you have to decide which group is going to have hegemony. That is, which group within this coalition between working class understood in a restrictive sense and working class understood as everyone that has to work. Which section of this coalition is going to be the top and which section is going to be the bottom, so to speak. Now, the question about who's what, and this, so when in the UK, when the trade union movement was much stronger, so in the 70s, for instance, when 13.5 million people were members of trade unions, and 6.5 million were members of unions affiliated with the Labour Party. That meant that their members were able to vote in Labour leadership elections and other important elections. So during this period, unions had a lot of say within the party, and they had constitutional guarantee that they still have a lot of say in the party, but they had a majority say over all the important and key decisions within the party. But obviously, as a result of deindustrialization and the incredibly restrictive legislation constraining unions imposed by Thatcher, the leverage that unions had over the party decreased. So what's important to note here is that from the perspective of a kind of a social democratic party that wants to abandon socialism, this isn't a bad thing, because there are political costs to being a socialist party that tries to being a socialist party that has to represent a militant working class, because if you working class that's going on strikes will make a Labour Party incredibly if you have a working class that's going on strikes and driving up inflation, this is going to create lots of problems for a Labour Party, which is the political representative of this class. So, but then these kind of disadvantages go away if the coalition is organized in such a way as to treat the working class as the junior partners within the coalition. And then what justifies this from the perspective of a Labour Party is this idea that the working class have nowhere else to go. So you can have a kind of you can kind of win working class people over with welfare that's means tested, but then promised not to support unions in industrial disputes. So, for instance, in the 90s, Blair said that the Labour's relationship to the unions is one of fairness and not favours. So in this approach, what Blair is doing is that he's treating the unions as just another group within civil society. They're not something they're not a group that has a particular special relationship to the Labour Party. They're just any other group. So, like within this context, the task that the left in the Corbyn era faced was one of trying to build political power in the absence of any organized working class. So to do this, Labour tried to organize a broad coalition of like the many versus the few, and this is kind of and what they were trying to do here was organize what they were trying to do here was to conceive of the working class in the broadest possible sense. That is, everyone that had to work for a living. But the dilemma of doing that is that you end up kind of you end up demobilizing you end up not taking seriously the fact that the working class as a kind of as a political group that needs to be mobilized isn't very active, and part of the role that Labour needs to play is to support them in industrial disputes. And you can see this in so there was a recent news article about Keir Starmer, who Keir Starmer refused to support the teachers' union, which was against sending teachers back into work. And it seems like a really strange thing for a Labour leader to do. Why would a Labour leader not support a teachers' union when the teachers don't feel it's safe to go back to work because of coronavirus? And the reason is that he doesn't. On the one hand, there's a political benefit to taking the side of a union in this kind of industrial dispute, but there's also, from his perspective, a cost to not taking the side of the unions, which is like weakening the broader electoral coalition that he's trying to form with people outside of his class. And just like Blair, what Starmer attempted to do is to take the working class for granted and say, oh well, they don't have anywhere else to go. So within this context, what lots of activists around the Corbyn movement tried to do was to use the membership and try to build and with the hope of building a closer relationship between the membership and social movements to broaden the base of the Labour Party. And I think that there's lots of kind of good spirit behind these kinds of efforts to build closer connections between the party and social movements. But the problem is that these social movements tend to not have a very broad base within society as a whole. So all they tend to be focused around single issue campaigns. So for instance, you have something like Extinction Rebellion, which is drawing our attention to climate change in a really important way. But then the kind of base of that kind of movement is overwhelmingly middle class and not representative of the public as a whole. So I think what's good about these kind of attempts to use kind of party democracy to try to broaden the base of the Labour Party and to create a base for the Labour Party is that they recognise the problem. But then the kind of social milieu of the people that make up the kind of activist cadre of these organisations just isn't broad enough to build a base. And then what I suggested in the article is that kind of the best kind of a better kind of starting point would be to look to where you already have lots of people with a close connection to the Labour Party, which is in the trade union movement. And I'll just finish on this. There are kind of 3.5 million people within affiliated unions that are related to the Labour Party. Organising within these workplaces would allow people to to interact with a much broader section of society and appeal to a much broader section of society than any kind of social movement activism would.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much for that, John-Baptiste. The most provocative take, I think, for the whole session. I think it was a good one to start, since we're all letting our party line and our sort of internal guard drop. I'll move next on to Grace Blakeley. Go ahead, Grace. Grace, so we can't hear you. Is you?
I'm muted. Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. Thanks, John-Baptiste, for that excellent discussion, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm going to talk a little bit differently, and I suppose what I'm going to try and do is put the situation that we face now in a wider kind of political economic context. Because I think if we want to understand the future of the left today, we have to think about the challenges that we are likely to face. And to do that, I think we need to understand that the Corbyn and Sanders project arose out of a very particular historical conjuncture. So obviously, in the wake of 2008, we had the near collapse of capitalism in the financial crisis, coupled with the unprecedented lengths that states went to save their financial systems, and the way in which the cost of that were heaped on ordinary people. So whether that was through kind of foreclosures and mass unemployment in the US, through a kind of deep austerity program in the UK, the promise that was so prevalent before the financial crisis that, you know, the economy would keep growing, everyone would be able to get on the housing ladder, things would keep getting better, was suddenly broken. And obviously, you know, initially in the midst of that crisis, there was a hope that amongst, you know, many people that things would eventually just get back to normal, as there often are during the depths of very severe crises generated by capitalism. And the left obviously initially kind of sat back and thought, right, well, there's this massive crisis, you know, obviously this is going to prove everything we've been saying for the last 30 years right. We just have to wait for everyone to realise and vote in a socialist government. That didn't happen. And, you know, many people were surprised at the, I suppose, at the ease with which the ruling classes were able to shore up their hegemony in the wake of the financial crisis. And I think, again, that was partly due to that tendency in the wake of crises that people have, where they presume that ultimately things will return to the way they were before the crisis if they just give it long enough. The Corbyn Sanders moment arises when that is no longer possible to believe anymore, when it is no longer possible for people to believe that things will eventually go back to normal, when people kind of, especially young people, begin to realize that there is no returning to the pre-crisis period, and where, you know, a generation arises that can barely even remember the pre-crisis period and is instead accustomed to post-crisis capitalism. And post-crisis capitalism has obviously not been particularly dynamic, to say the least. So we've obviously seen growth in many parts of the global north fairly stagnant. Productivity has been stagnant, and associated with that has been a secular decoupling between the productivity growth, which has not been great, and wage growth. So we've seen the wage share of national income in almost every rich country around the world fall, and the profit share in many of those countries rise. Inequality's been going up. We've actually just seen, obviously, inequality is very high in the US and the UK. We've been told for quite a long time, you know, inequality has been about the same since the 1990s. Recently, some statistics have come out showing that we've been dramatically underestimating the extent of income inequality, because we've been failing to account for income that is disguised as capital gains or as other forms of wealth. So, you know, huge levels of inequality, a growing amount of national income accruing to capital rather than labour. And in the context of, you know, things like slowing growth and slowing productivity, which perhaps, you know, shouldn't be of that much concern to Marxists, the only thing that's been keeping our economy alive has been something that maybe, you know, should be of concern or is of concern now, which has been a slow accretion of huge amount of debt, and an asset price boom inflated by quantitative easing. So the fact that we had very tight fiscal policy and loose monetary policy in many parts of particularly Europe, to a lesser extent in the US, which has its own political economic conditions, which I'll come back to later, related to its imperial role in the global economy. But in the UK, we have this combination of very tight fiscal policy and very loose monetary policy, which is tailor-made to support the interests of a conservative electoral coalition, which is effectively comprised of, you know, capitalists, and older homeowners. So it boosts asset prices whilst Jean-Baptiste's earlier definition, anyone who earns a wage, anyone who is literally actively working, is much more likely to vote Labour than they are Conservative, actually, regardless of their age, although obviously does decrease in likelihood as they get older. It is actually older homeowners and particularly retired people who form the basis of that electoral coalition, obviously in part because huge portions of the working class no longer vote. And that has been, again, because of what Jean-Baptiste was mentioning earlier, basically the cartelisation of the Labour Party, where it became increasingly a kind of elite project staffed by, university-educated, London-based, middle-class career politicians who made it their mission to kind of shake off the shackles of their identity, the Labour Party's identity as a representative of the working classes. So yeah, this combination was tailor-made to support the Conservative electoral coalition, and this is at least partly why they were able to maintain that for such a long time, because austerity, whilst it was, if you look at it from the perspective of economic fundamentals, not good for the economy, it was good for the coalition of rentier interests, in particular constellations of British capital, which is highly internationalized and highly financialized, and this is kind of what maintained that stability for quite a long time. But there were obviously, contradictions that were bubbling away beneath the surface, and we are now beginning to realize the results of that. So, partly, one of the results of this attempt to combine very loose monetary policy and tight fiscal policy, and this is the case all around the world, has been the accretion of huge amounts of debt, and particularly in the corporate sector. Now, obviously, before the crisis, you have this massive buildup of debt in the financial sector and amongst households. And that house of cards comes tumbling down in 2008. Since then, we've had a massive accretion of debt amongst corporations, particularly in the US. You've basically got a massive corporate debt bubble because there's been very low interest rates and because it's been easier for firms to borrow on financial markets because of quantitative easing that's basically pushed people into buying assets like high yield corporate bonds or junk bonds where otherwise they might not. So you have this big accretion of debt. You get zombie firms, which are firms that can barely afford to pay the interest on their debts, let alone pay off the principal. And again, this drives down productivity. These kind of contradictions, both the very fact of that stagnant productivity, which is supposed to be the long-term driver of capitalist growth, and the potential for another debt-based crisis as a result of this accumulation of debt in the corporate sector, which is also very severe in the UK. At the same time, quantitative easing and loose monetary policy keep asset prices very high. So in the UK, where property, particularly in London, is just another asset class, house prices remain very high when they should have fallen, according to any kind of standard assessment of how they were overvalued before the financial crisis. And also, particularly in the US, equity prices were kept very, very high, which was again a mechanism in the US of kind of maintaining support for that system in a country where a lot of middle class people are invested in one way or another in the stock market. But obviously, these two things both created problems too. So rising house prices in the UK means young people can't afford to get on the property ladder, feeds into that massive growing intergenerational divide, which is not, I don't think, primarily a cultural thing, but rather a question of ownership of assets. The mass provision of asset ownership prior to the financial crisis through the creation of debt was the glue that held the coalitions of both New Labour and of the Conservative governments that were in power during that time together. And obviously, the mass channeling of money into equity markets has created a boom, particularly in US stock markets, that burst very rapidly when the coronavirus crisis hit, only to reflate again, thanks to the big monopolies, which have again been another massive beneficiary of this particular constellation of macroeconomic policy we've seen since the crisis. These big tech companies have thrived in this environment, using cheap credit to consolidate their monopoly position, watching their stock prices rise far above what you'd expect, given the amount of profit that they're actually generating. and just really trading off their ability to gain complete and utter control of the market that they're operating in. And meanwhile, the environment is collapsing. Now, all of these things start to erode all the stories that we're told about capitalism. So, monopoly completely and utterly belies this story that we're told about competition. The part of the kind of founding ideology of neoliberalism was that one day everyone will be able to own their own home, everyone will be able to invest in the stock market. That is clearly not true anymore. Another, the forces of kind of Schumpeterian competition are supposed to mean that the weak die and the strong thrive, and that just doesn't happen when these zombie firms are able to survive on the back of a very cheap debt. So these contradictions are kind of bubbling away under the surface. And then the coronavirus crisis hits. And it threatens to bring the whole fragile thing crashing down again. And again, the state steps in to do everything it can to stop this collapse. So, states and central banks have undertaken unprecedented in the history of capitalism measures to deal with this pandemic. They are lending, and this is states all around the world at the same time, to the extent that they're able to do it. Some states obviously are facing a dual crisis of the pandemic and a massive flight out of their currency, which is capitalizing a global South debt crisis of the scale that we've never really seen before. But in the global North, states have created huge amounts of money to bail out the corporate sector, again, bringing back in that focus around the corporate sector, that is really where the rot is today, rather than in the finance sector itself. As well as backstopping incomes. And again, backstopping incomes so that people are able to pay their debts and pay their rents and all these sorts of things that keep capital flowing. So the state has stepped in to save capitalism once again. And we can assume that they will use all the resources available to them, that states, central banks will use all the resources available to them to bail out elites, to bail out the rest of the ruling classes. And again, that working people suffer the consequences of this crisis. And the kind of suffering that we are going to see as a result of this crisis is already, but is going to continue to be unlike anything that most of us, talk about me because I'm relatively young, but that I've definitely ever seen in my life. So in the UK, we've not seen unemployment above, at the levels of 3 million people, which is what we're likely to see as this escalates in my lifetime. In the US, the unemployment level has not been seen in in probably the lifetimes of a lot of the people watching this call. And that is in the context of the ongoing erosion of our welfare systems in the UK, and of the fact that, losing your job potentially means losing your healthcare in the US. I don't think many of us, all cooped up in lockdown, have yet wrapped our head around how bad this is going to get. And, at the moment, we're seeing people saying, right, businesses are going to start opening again, things are going to get better. The economic pain, this always happens during big, severe crises. You saw it in the middle of 2007. The market rallies, things get better, everyone kind of fools themselves into believing it's all over, and then the next crash comes and it's bigger. And I think, that is ultimately where we're heading. And then we have the question about what states are going to do about this. Because whilst there are similarities in the sense this is another crisis that is emerging from the contradictions of capitalism, this is not going to be like 2008. Partly because the scale will be so much bigger, but partly because, for all the reasons I've just mentioned, the legitimacy of capitalism as a system has been eroded so substantially. You just have to look at all the opinion polls that have been done amongst young people in many countries in the global North about their approval rating for capitalism, to see quite how weak the legitimacy that underpins this system is. And I think what's really interesting about this crisis in particular is that it will accelerate a trend we've been seeing for a very long time, which is a trend towards the state being used much more frequently as a backstop for capital accumulation. So capitalism basically failing without the help and support of states and central banks, and of growing monopoly power in many, many different industries. And then you start to get to a system where effectively you've got a very small number of people, the heads of the big monopolies, central bankers, politicians, effectively planning a huge swathe of economic activity. It's these guys who are making decisions about which firms live, which firms die, what resources get used, how resources get used. And this begins to then erode another key source of legitimacy for the neoliberal capitalism, which is the separation between economics and politics. the idea that, and this is what the austerity discourse was founded on, that there are certain things that are just outside of the realm of politics. Lots of areas of economics, you can't discuss them because they're not political issues. They're up to the experts. You've got to leave it to the experts. Now, when you have a state, a democratically elected government that is effectively running the economy, as it will be, as most economies in the global north will be when this crisis ends, those lines, those clear demarcations between what constitutes politics and what constitutes economics become much more blurred. And that creates space for very significant demands to be made of states by movements. Now, I think, coming back to what we can learn from Corbyn and Sanders is that, we can obviously learn that the inherent contradictions created by capitalism can create spaces in which we can organize, but they do not obviously lead to any inevitable victory, as we've seen over the last couple of years, tragically. And if we let this crisis pass without learning the right lessons and without properly organizing, then the right will use it instead. They will, as we're already seeing, potentially use it very, very successfully to create a kind of, a kind of crippled fortress capitalism that exists within the global north, where those contradictions continue to mount. So where it becomes more and more difficult to deal with basic questions about production and resource allocation, but where those with the power and the privilege decide, instead of solving those issues, we're going to just distribute what is left amongst ourselves. So that's, white people in the global north. And, you only have to look about what's going on now to just have an inkling of how bad things will be if we allow the climate crisis to worsen. If you look at the impact that Cyclone Idai has had on India and Bangladesh in the midst of this pandemic, that's just an iota of the kind of suffering that's going to be caused if we continue to allow the collapse of all our ecological systems. So I think, another lesson that we can learn is that it's really up to us to understand what's going on, to understand these trends in capitalism, to educate ourselves and each other, and to be prepared for the crisis when it comes. And not to be prepared for the crisis in the sense that we say, right, the crisis is here, so obviously everyone's going to like socialism now because capitalism's failed. Be prepared for the crisis in the sense of being very well organized. And that is obviously, as Jean-Baptiste hinted to earlier, the big thing that was missing from the Corbyn and Sanders movements. Now, in many ways, that was inevitable because, in many ways, the left approached electoral politics in, 2015, 16, from a perspective of profound weakness. We had basically been like, nothing else has worked. The politics of protest haven't worked. Let's give this a go and see what happens. And then we were astonished by our own success and suddenly looked around us and realized, wow, we're really on our own here. Like, we have not built out any of the other social forces that we'd need to achieve the kind of victory, to achieve the kind of socialist transformation that we would want. And, this is a cliche, and I'm sure others are going to talk more about how we actually, like the nuts and bolts of how we actually do this. But obviously, we need to be using this moment to build our power as a movement and to realize our own power actually as a movement. Because again, coming to where we've come from this perspective of weakness has not been beneficial to us. We've been overly focused on the electoral route because we've thought we can't build power in wider society. I think what's happening in the US right now is you're seeing the power of a movement that realizes its own power. And the mere fact in many ways of making our strength known is part of how we build power in wider society. So yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about how we build out that movement. I think that's probably one for the discussion, and I'm sure other people will address that in much more depth than I have. But obviously a key part of that has to be the labour movement. And partly that's to do with just, the fact of organising, but partly it's to do with those problems and those contradictions that I mentioned earlier in my talk, because how are you going to take on the power of some of the biggest monopolies that have ever existed in the history of capitalism? You're going to need a labour movement that is strong and that is able to do something that we've never really seen done before, which is organised throughout supply chains within a particular firm. And you're going to need a strong labour movement as well for the purposes of creating another kind of democracy, economic democracy. Obviously, we're going to see huge numbers of firms in state hands or, receiving state support when this crisis is over. There's going to be a very strong case for saying, these things are in the public hands. They should be run by the people for the people, and that means pushing for worker ownership. So I think we have to be prepared to make these arguments, but more than that, we have to be prepared to organise. And on that, I will hand back over to Marcus.
Thanks for that, Grace. Thank you very much. And I will now hand straight back to David, if he's there.
Oh,
David, you there?
bad timing.
Have we lost you? Oh, Jesus.
Uh-oh.
Right.
We can go straight to questions if you want, and then come back to him when he
Yeah,
comes back on.
Good idea.
Is he there?
Easing us. Hello, David. Hello. Oh, false hope. So I mean, right. Well, since we've had an unexpected tussle there, I suppose it's my chance to pick on you two. Yeah, thanks for those two really, really interesting and provocative offers. I suppose, since we're dealing with largely an American audience, I'm gonna try and move this into, obviously, Grace, you had some very stark warnings there about the complete lack of legitimacy that the system has, this completely unprecedented global crisis that's, unfolding before our very eyes. And also that across the world, socialism is being seen as an increasingly popular solution to, plenty of these problems. And, the objective circumstances, as they say, are all there. But, where does that leave us in Britain, where we kind of had our historic moment? We had Corbynism, and we completely dashed it on the rocks, didn't we? And we've got a Labour leader now who's, he's a knight of the realm. He's far to the right of Jeremy Corbyn. So I suppose what we could talk about now is, is like, where do you two see, where do you stand on the debates in the left over whether to work with Keir Starmer or not, whether to be a constructive force within his ranks, or whether we should be a much more, solid left bloc acting as a kind of, like a unchangeable, force within the party. Would you like to start with that, maybe, John-Baptiste?
Yeah, I find it quite difficult to understand what's at stake in discussions about whether or not we should work constructively with Keir Starmer, or whether or not we should criticize him. If he's choosing to exclude the left, then it doesn't matter whether or not you want to work constructively with him, because you won't get an opportunity to do so. And then the second issue is like the leverage that it is. So this, I guess, is another problem with the attempt to kind of get leverage over a leader of a party through the membership. Is you see that, I don't know, how kind of weak and inconsequential the expressions of kind of dissatisfaction with the leader are when you don't have a leader which is in line with your politics, or who's going to be sympathetic. So, for instance, when Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, criticisms of the kind of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party were taken very seriously. He responded to them quite often. Criticism of Labour's stance on criticism of Labour's stance on all manner of social justice issues were taken really seriously. But then, for Starmer, the left doesn't have his ear, so it doesn't really matter whether or not you want to take a kind of constructive or critical stance towards him, because there's nothing to be gained from him by winning political capital from a social group which is already marginal. I suppose the kind of strategic. It's just difficult to think about how a left can kind of win back control of the Labour Party without trying to increase the influence that the unions have over the party, and trying to yeah, it just doesn't seem like all other kind of criticism of Starmer seems just moralistic, because there doesn't seem very much power behind it.
And what about you, Grace? Oh, David's back.
I'm happy to yield to David and come back to it.
Okay.
I yield my time.
David, we just had an impromptu conversation there, just waiting for you. Fire straight away.
It's good to mix up the format. Yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, obviously, if we look at the discussion today about shifting towards a contribution-based, welfare system or social insurance rather than universal services and rights, it looks like a big retreat, and it looks a bit like Keir Starmer represents a sort of turn back to the pre-Corbyn era, when we had leaders like Ed Miliband and Gordon Brown, and in a sense even worse, because the Labour leadership is adopting these kind of centrist managerial positions after we had a great moment when it seemed possible to change the terms of political debate, and of course also after the COVID crisis. But even so, I mean, I think it is important to recognise that the situation for the left in Britain today is a lot better than it was before Corbyn's election as leader. I mean, because I think like Corbyn's leadership and the battles we had, even though we lost, have given us something of a better idea of like how we would go about making Labour into a socialist party and advancing a socialist politics in Britain. Because certainly when I was first involved in the left, the radical left in the 2000s, the kind of social movements like the anti-globalization movement, anti-Iraq war, some of the environmentalist stuff I was doing, it was certainly possible to maintain protest movements and opposition to what the Blair government was doing. But it was kind of common sense that the Labour Party could never be made into an instrument of socialism. And, that wasn't just something that people outside the Labour Party said, saying it was a bourgeois party run by the middle classes in which the union power was bound to decline. But even people on the left of the party had very little idea about how they'd go about changing it. It's easy in retrospect to think, like, if we think of, Corbyn and McDonnell, also people like, John Landsman, people in CLP, Campaign for Labour Party Democracy and so on, people stuck around in the Labour Party for decades who'd seen no sign of progress in trying to change it. I was involved in John McDonnell's leadership campaign in 2007. He didn't come close to getting on the ballot. So it was like, whether or not you were in the Labour Party, there was like no strategy, no vision of how we could make progress. It was a matter of holding on to the last few constituencies where there were socialist MPs supporting protest movements and so on. But it was hard to think of how we'd actually go about making political change or, taking institutional power of any kind. So I think like the great success of Corbynism, or Corbyn's leadership, let's say, is that it showed that the Labour Party as an institution, despite everything, despite all the bureaucratic resistance, despite the right-wing MPs, it showed that it was more malleable as an institution than we thought, that it was more open to change. But at the same time, I think it's true also that the last 5 years kind of did more to show the possibility that that this was a terrain to be fought over, rather than actually providing a kind of a coherent model or like a project for changing society in general, making kind of structural reforms and kind of entrenching victories that would last even beyond like temporary electoral defeats and setbacks and so on. So I think in this sense, it might be a mistake to talk about Corbynism in the sense of an ism ideology, in the sense that it didn't like map out a clear project of reform, or still less a kind of road towards socialism as an end goal in the manner that the sort of historic reformist social democracy did, or even say movements like like Euro-communists and so on might have done in the past. I think it's fair to say that the Corbyn Labour Party's positions were much more ambiguous, less programmatically defined, less strategic. Clearly, part of Corbyn's appeal and the reason why he won the 2015 leadership race was that he represented, he'd always been an outsider, someone without career ambitions. One could say, it wasn't like he was like an authoritarian leader or even a particularly charismatic one. But he had this sort of slightly kind of this kind of moral socialism, sort of speaking simple truths to power, and that was something very attractive. And he's someone who'd stuck to what he believes, supports very minoritarian causes, even when they couldn't get a hearing in national media. And that was also apparent on the kind of attacks he faced as leader, even concerning views that Corbyn didn't campaign or seek to put at the heart of debate. So if we think of things like his opposition to nuclear weapons or his republicanism, those are things which are normally totally absent from mainstream British political debate, and Corbyn didn't talk about them when he was leader, but they were endlessly wheeled out in the attempt to discredit him. I think that kind of ambiguity in Corbynism was accentuated after the 2017 general election. When Theresa lost her majority, Labour came within a few tens or hundreds of thousands of votes of being able to form a coalition. Because the effect of that was that the idea of winning the unity of all wings of the party became stronger, and right-wing oppositionists, people like Stephen Kinnock and Tom Watson and so on, their ability to slam Corbyn and rule him out as purely illegitimate was weakened. So then there was a kind of unequal, a sort of rather ambiguous sort of truce between the different wings of the party, and the leadership began to take up more the idea of representing the broad church and this kind of idea. Thanks to the report published it wasn't published, the report leaked a few months ago on what was going on in the party HQ, we know exactly what a lot of the party officials thought of Corbyn, like expressing disappointment that he hadn't lost the 2017 election, or not lost it worse. But while some such figures were displaced from their roles in the party machine, at the same time, the party position on Brexit notably was defined by constructive ambiguity, kind of trying to be all things to all people. And then there was a distinction between Corbyn's perceived radicalism than the actual policy agenda which we were talking about. So, and I think all of those things kind of kept at bay the confrontation that was necessary to establish the left's control over the party machine, but deselect right-wing MPs, but also in the sense of kind of building the specific organization of the left in the party, or specifically socialist media, party education structures, this kind of stuff, that would have been able to survive the defeat we suffered in December 19. I think it's probably fair to say that there was too much of the horizon of kind of the idea that Corbyn could be prime minister, and perhaps not enough of building towards those kind of end goals. In general, I think in the Corbyn project, clearly implicit in it was the idea that where other types of protest movement had proven too weak, or like social movements and trade unions and so on were not strong, that basically if Corbyn was prime minister, then he'd be able to sort of, from the top down, be partly able to resolve some of those problems, like rolling back anti-union laws and so on. Yet, at the same time, it's kind of, it's also clear that had we actually formed a government together with like liberals and the SNP, never mind the right wingers within the party, that some sort of confrontation would have had to take place eventually. So I think, therefore, the 2017 result had a very contradictory effect. Like, definitely the most positive legacy of the kind of Corbyn experience is like, I'm myself, I'm like 31 years old. It's like you go to a Labour Party conference and there's like 18-year-olds who basically haven't missed out on anything by not being involved in the left for the previous 10 years. It's like they've been politicised, arrived in the Labour Party, become active, already thinking like it's realistic that we could have a socialist government in this country within a few years, and who don't have a like kind of minoritarian or subcultural outlook, and who are directly, immediately involved in mass outward-facing politics in a really positive way. And who sort of saw the need for kind of state-level action, immediate reformist policies. But at the same time, if you read, for example, like Alex Doherty did a really good interview for Politics Theory, where he interviewed Christine Berry. The title of we published it as an article on Jacobin called "Making Corbynism a Reality," and what they talk about based on Christine and Jacobin's book, "People Get Ready," is like what I think it shows is that the knowledge among members, even among the very active, about what exactly Labour's economic strategy would be, what its 5-10 year horizon would be in power, was quite low. So instead, what we saw in the 2019 election was a kind of a bunch of isolated policy announcements, which, while good unto themselves, didn't really make up a very coherent project. And also, if we think of things like the Green New Deal, which is like an excellent framing device and way of connecting the big issues of our time in terms of the types of work that don't exist anymore, or obviously the climate agenda. I think that remained much too much a sort of a slogan rather than something that really broke down into something people could understand as policies realizable in their particular local area. And talking again about Christine Berry's interview with Alex Doherty, like the whole discourse around democratizing the economy, employee ownership, that kind of stuff, it wasn't really something that came from within the Labour movement. It was more like a kind of idea for once Labour was eventually in government, it would then be able to sort of hand that down. But it had the contradiction of it was kind of like a call for democracy, but which didn't itself have kind of like legs and depth in a wider movement. But at the same time, as I say, it's mistaken to imagine that there's a certain common sense on the radical left, perhaps in years past, that electoral politics only ever sort of reflects a movement that has already taken place in wider society. You have the grassroots pressure, which then institutional politics somehow channel. Corbyn's leadership, the fact that he was able to become elected leader, relied on some really chance events in terms of like where he got the nominations from, the way the British electoral system doesn't allow other left-wing parties to rise to Labour's left. And those things contributed to a real opportunity. At the same time, though, it's for that same reason. Like if you think of the different kind of political or generational experiences, the different class fractions that came into Labour after 2015, whether that's like perhaps older activists who'd become disillusioned during the Blair years, or whether it's younger people with sort of downwardly mobile middle classes, or like sort of precarious young workers. I think the problem we had is that using Corbyn as a kind of cipher, sort of looking people kind of projected what they wanted to onto his leadership, but because there wasn't the kind of process of building party education structures, making people from working class backgrounds, people with even, in fact, probably particularly like people with, say, low cultural capital, like the lack of processes to make them into leaders, meant that what instead happened was you had a kind of marrying together of different political scenes and not really something new which transcended them and gave them strategic purpose. And I think that was firstly reflected in the language of an ecumenical broad church, which, you know, just like everyone comes together, but there's not some higher moment of where we understand like how this particular moment, how, you know, like some of the things Grace talked about, like how does the economic situation of Britain in 2015 or 2020, like how realistic actually is it to talk about what we could do if we were in office, or, you know, if we're in office with liberals and so on. I think that discussion didn't really take place. What we instead tended to have was a fracturing over kind of identitarian issues, the most obvious of which was Brexit. So that tended to produce a kind of discussion, and I think it's something we're suffering even now if you look in the debate over what Momentum should do next, where different factions each champion one particular section of the working class, claiming that it should stand in for the whole, but it's difficult to kind of rally them together behind a sort of a specifically socialist project, like the idea that of a socialist transformation of society is actually possible, and kind of thinking through what that means strategically. So instead, we have a discussion which is limited to the idea of who we should be representing, as if they were kind of like just like pre-existing categories which we wouldn't be able to sort of cohere into something greater than the sum of its parts. So I started by saying that, you know, I finished, but I started by saying this, I think the situation is better in 2015, but it's also true, and I think it's, you know, a lesson that can be generalized or indeed seen in other cases if we think of things like Podemos or France Insoumise as well. Is that there was a great opportunity, a crumbling of the sort of the project of turning Labour into a liberal middle class party, and that opened it up to be invested, or sort of, you know, to take in different forces, different politics, and we had some success in setting the agenda for a while, and, you know, a lot of people are going to learn the lesson from that, which I think is good, that Labour is indeed a battleground. It's not just this fixed thing, and, you know, we can push ourselves and socialist ideas and arguments into the institutional political arena. At the same time, now that we've lost the leadership, it's been remarkable to see the sort of rate of decline. Like, you know, when Keir Starmer, you know, Marcus mentioned earlier that Rebecca Long-Bailey lost the leadership contest, and, you know, at the time of that election, you know, in Keir Starmer, in his first video, he was all talking about how he used to support, you know, as a young man in the 80s, he'd been on picket lines, he always had this like powerful personal connection to the Labour movement, and yet, you know, since becoming the leader, has rapidly dropped any sense of that kind of mass politics, stopped talking about socialism and so on, and just, you know, sort of wanting to pose as a more sort of managerial and serious alternative to the Tories, but on the same basic political terrain. So on that level, I think it's illusory to suggest that we could somehow influence or have the attention of Starmer. You know, he's certainly not interested in listening to us, as Jean-Baptiste said, At the same time, though, I think a certain political space has been opened up within the Labour Party, and what was done and what's seemed possible for the last 5 years isn't just going to disappear, particularly because there's literally thousands of new activists who wouldn't have been around otherwise or doing anything particularly effective. So I think even if we had a greater opportunity to reshape the party, to create political education, to build up working class leadership, all those things, that was easier when Corbyn was leader, for certain. But I think at the same time, it's not just a field of ruins, and those are things we can reasonably discuss sort of doing even now.
No, thank you very much for that, David. I'm very, very conscious of the time now, and I don't want to keep you all waiting. So I will try my best. Sorry, folks, I won't be able to get all the way through these questions, but I'll try my best to amalgamate these questions and in the comments. Unsurprisingly, plenty are on Momentum. We've indirectly touched on Momentum already tonight. Many American viewers, might have just heard all the propaganda, but they might not know that throughout the British Labour movement, it was like a little bit of an open secret that, it had these real problems. People would say that it suffered from a real lack of any sort of political education. It was unconnected to the broader movement. It had a bit of a stupid social media presence. A complete lack of clarity over, as John-Baptiste mentioned earlier, whether it was a social movement or whether it was an internal faction of the Labour left. Plenty of people felt all sorts of things about it, and as a result, we've got a quite big internal debate in the ongoing elections to Momentum's National Coordinating Group, which is the governing body of the largest organisation in the Labour left. So I wondered if we could maybe finish it by asking all panelists for their current thoughts on the ongoing debate in Momentum's internal election, what the reflections on Momentum, as the biggest, organ of the Labour left is, and how they personally see Momentum, also going forward, as we as socialists face new challenges, both immediate and in the long term. So I suppose I'll go straight back on you actually with that, David.
You're underwater,
David.
Yeah.
which you're clearly not visibly, but still.
Did you hear none of that, David?
I didn't hear anything you said. No, sorry.
You were going in and out, Marcus. Can you repeat the question?
Okay,
Yeah.
so oh Jesus, all right. Well, I mean, okay, so very long story short, there's an
You've done it again. Okay, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Marcus, your mic keeps cutting out weirdly.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, if you just stay there.
I'm going to do it as quick as possible. What are your thoughts on what Momentum, as the largest organisation of the Labour left, should be doing in the near future? And what are your thoughts about the internal elections and the debate going on? Starting with Broder.
Yeah. So I think the kind of what I said is that we need an organisation that will create a lasting and explicitly socialist and working class led force within the Labour Party, and which is oriented, of course, towards the labour and trade union movement, and helps give political expression to socialist ideas. I think actually one of the strange things about Momentum over the last 5 years is it hasn't actually really done that. It's been more like a mobilizing structure at election time rather than really serving something that can build up cadres. I mean, I think building up cadres, or cadres as some American comrades say, is really important. It's like, how do you take people who perhaps don't have endless free time, people who maybe don't have a lot of educational capital or whatever, and make them into the faces of our movement? Because I think it's during the Corbyn leadership, when Sky News or the BBC wanted people to speak on behalf of the Corbyn project, they'd often rely on people from alternative media like our own, which is great. And if you look at Navarra in particular, actually, I think that they've been really impressive in filling that role. But at the same time, what we also need to have is people who people who are working class activists, who are trade union activists, become a visible presence, become our organisers. I mean, I gave a talk on this channel a couple of weeks ago about the Italian Communist Party, about how it. I talked about how it took people who had to leave school in their teens or younger, and made them into national level leaders. And I think that's something really important, particularly if you look at the way in which the Labour Party has been taken over by the middle classes over decades. I read a piece of research a few weeks ago. I mentioned a recent Jacobin article, which was even in the early 1980s, about 70% of Labour MPs were former blue-collar workers, and now that's under 8%. So under, and obviously, we can think of great examples of working class MPs who lost their seat in the last election. So, I don't think that it's purely a matter of representation or working class as one more identity or tick box for affirmative action, but it is a massive organizational problem, and it revealed itself also in the debates around Brexit and stuff. But I think the most useful thing Momentum could be doing would be to be doing the political education, be creating the links between the union movement and the processes of politicization and taking over office in Labour Party branches and so on, which can push back that shift from it being a sort of party of well-meaning or liberal opinion, and make it into a socialist party based on the British working class.
Brilliant, thank you. And John-Baptiste, would you like to go next?
You're muted.
Sorry, just on mute there, mate. Sorry, man, just on mute.
Yeah, I think I don't have very much to say. I agree with pretty much all of what David said. I would just only add that I think that I think that if you have a society like ours, and the US, which is incredibly unequal, and you have a group of very well-meaning but kind of detached from any kind of working class political organizations, a group of people that are like this, very well-meaning but detached from working class political organizations, and you have these people trying to do political organizing, the kind of natural mode that the form of kind of political and intellectual engagement that develops is going to be philanthropic, because they're not in any kind of direct relationship to working class people. But then what they do see, the only thing they're going to see is the extreme examples of suffering. So poverty, the people that are starving, the ones that are the people that are being victims of the worst kind of brutality by police, and all of these things which are really urgent and really pressing concerns, which I don't know, any kind of decent human being can't not help but feel angry at. But the problem is that kind of organizations, there's a certain kind of a social movementist kind of NGO approach which develops out of this detachment, and the result is that you end up kind of formulating political programs in ways that are just don't represent to the majority of people what's bad about capitalism and what's bad about neoliberalism. And then what's bad about it isn't these awful, horrific things which you see when you're detached from working class life, but just the fact that there's no possibility for agency. So I guess the point that the kind of the addendum that I'd add to David's point is just that finding a way of integrating organizations like Momentum to working class communities isn't just some kind of tokenistic thing isn't just valuable for tokenistic reasons, because it helps us to kind of have, I don't know, working class faces in high places. But it's good because it kind of informs the ethical worldview of these social movements. And that's just otherwise you're just going to do politics in this abstract way that's going to alienate, confuse, and kind of offend working class people who don't identify with these just really dramatic portrayals of the harms of capitalism.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Grace.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to what both of those guys have said. I agree with most of what's been said. I just think, when I think about this question of what Momentum should be doing and how it should be acting, I think so much about this question of political education, because the question that you asked before about Keir Starmer and how we engage with him, I think we have to confront the fact that a lot of people we need, whose support we need just within the Labour Party, if we were even thinking that we need to maintain some focus on the Labour Party as an institution, if we retain some orientation towards electoral power, then a lot of these people are people who are going to need to re-engage. How was it that people who voted for Corbyn also voted for Starmer? And I don't think it's difficult, for all the reasons that John-Baptiste has just said, to understand that. I mean, people came to Corbynism, a lot of young people came to Corbynism from progressive instincts, right? From these, shared sets of values or shared material interests that, led them to believe that capitalism was not the best mode of organizing society, or that for many people, neoliberal capitalism wasn't the best mode of organizing society, which is, again, a different thing. So how you translate those instincts and those material interests into consciousness is a very real and active question. I think whenever I think about this question of my granddad, who, is basically the reason that I do any of this, because, like, middle class person, like, what is my background in this? He was like, ran away from school when he was 14, joined the Merchant Navy, read the Communist Manifesto, and came back and joined the trade union movement. He was a shop steward in the TGWU, and that's where he got his political education. And it became so significant in his life that became like a core element of his identity, someone who'd never been formally educated, and it's come through via him to me. That such was the power of, I think, that cadre of self-educated, of autodidacts, socialists who emerged and came up in the union movement when that was a significant source of institutional power. How do we begin to replicate experiences like that? And Momentum is not going to be the whole answer, but I think it could be some of the answer, particularly, as I said, amongst those young people who, a lot of them, do have a very deep material interest in things being radically different than they currently are, even if they do fall into the kind of middle class educated category. But it's a question of how we, translate what I was just saying, that view of capitalism of, bad things are happening, I want them to be different, into a much more deep-seated and holistic analysis, whilst centering the voices of people who have the most profound material interest for things to change, and who have come up to the position that they occupy through organizing, through engaging with working class communities. And a big part of that is obviously the Labour movement. And Marcus, you're probably better placed than me to talk about how we rebuild power in the Labour movement. But yeah, Momentum needs to be part of that. It needs to be doing better political education. It needs to be engaging with communities where people's lives are literally on the line, and centering their voices, as people have said.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think that the task ahead of us now, really, as Tony Benn said, is to make, teach, and keep socialists. And in that light, I hope that you will consider subscribing, if you enjoyed this tonight, to Tribune or to Jacobin, who, that's two publications there that take the role of making, teaching, and keeping socialists, and building and moving our movement onwards and forwards. I hope you consider subscribing, or even just continuing watching these, because I think during lockdown they've been a really interesting and a really vital source of education for plenty of people, myself included. And I'll stop rambling now, because it's midnight. So I think we all want to get to bed. So thanks for watching. Thank you for all the contributors. Thank you to Kale and everyone at Jacobin for the tech stuff, and thanks for all the lovely comments. I'm sorry the time meant that I couldn't ask all of the questions. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye. Night.
Thanks.
Bye.
you.